Hi, welcome to Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. The podcast today is about parenting and how that influences from the past. The process of parenting is a fairly weird one in some senses. Not that parents are weird, I don't want to say that. But we kind of look at our process of being a parent only when we become parents, naturally, as you might say. But in becoming a parent, then the only thing we've got experience of being a parent is how we were parented. Now, that's a strange combination of processes, as you can imagine, because we're not one person in a parenting process. Usually there's two, and more often than not, there's two. And so that process of how we were parented by our parents influences how we parent our children. Now, the reason why that sometimes becomes an issue for some people is that when we do that process, then the influence of our being parented tells us how that job should be done. But if, whilst we were children, there was some kind of issue around our world, our life, trauma events, situations of loss, situations of processes of disconnection, then what might happen for some people is that that process overlays the parenting we are doing with our children. So I'll give you an example of that. So when we go through a process as a parent, we might have a young child. And if, for example, that young child gets to 3-year-old, for example. So if we then react to that 3-year-old child, we're not just going to react in the moment with the situation that's happening. We might bring upon our process of being parented at 3-year-old, and that then overlays this process with that child. So if, for example, when we were 3 and we were being parented, we had somebody close to us die, somebody close to us leave, and there was a disconnection process of loss. Then what might happen when we have a 3-year-old child, we could become overprotective of that child. We could utilize that experience we had when we were 3-year-old and then say, okay, there's a danger here. There's a process of emotional disturbance. And subconsciously, not consciously, because most of our world is subconscious, to be honest, as an operating process, then we will be overprotective probably to that child. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily an issue, because usually the other parent, if there's two parents in the relationship with the child, they will have a different process of growing up. So they may be able to moderate that. They may be able to balance it out, basically. But if that process is more enhanced and we become more secure, then that balancing out might not be able to have happened. So our partner, relationship partner, the other parent, might see this overprotectiveness and they might make an assumption that it's something else because our perception is our reality. So that overprotectiveness might come across with the other parent, our partner, in this process as being something that is wrong. So they would react to what they see in the moment, and that might ensnare with some aspect of turbulence in the relationship. It might not be much, but it might be a lot. Depends on how we react and interact. So as we're going through that process of parenting, then our parenting process, our experiential model, if you like, is going to influence that. Now, that's not something that people generally think about or look at. We just go from day to day, don't we? We don't really think too deeply about what we do usually. But when there's some kind of turbulence in a relationship from what we perceive as counsellors, then there's a need sometimes not to look at what is happening in the moment, but also what might be historically happening as an experiential process. Because that influence will be there in some way, shape or form. But if we're not aware of it and we don't understand it, then we will just react as you would, to the normal process that's happening in front of you. So that turbulence in the relationship might produce a disconnection within the couple. So that's a bit weird, because what it can do sometimes, and I have experiences like this with the counselling, where people come to me, what it can do is, if it's very traumatic, that separation as 3-year-old child, it can drive us to actually bring our relationship into a process of disconnection. And that can be extreme. That can be, I'm getting a divorce. It comes out the blue. What's all this about? Where did it come from? And that process means that that disconnection may then be a forced process without being aware of why. And these things happen all the time. These things are occurring through most of what we do without even realizing. And that is very scary sometimes, because it can lead us into the very thing that we're fearful of is the very thing we actually make happen in order to fit our experiential model. So then we carry that on, and we carry it on down through the generations, because that then, if it did cause a rift in the relationship to the point where the parents separated, divorced, then your 3-year-old child will obviously have that traumatic process. And that then could be their experiential model that they take forward to when they become parents. Now, these things normally don't get in the way as much. I mean, trauma obviously can get in the way with everybody without even having children. But when there is children, then it's helpful to look at these background histories and to see if there's anything in there. Now, if it doesn't necessarily produce a major conflict, and there's some kind of balancing process with the other partner as a parenting model, then that might dissipate. That might just be, well, what are you doing that for? Why are you being so protective now? I don't know why. I just feel as though I need to keep them safe. Okay, well, do you think that's really the way to do it? And there might be some conversation between the parental influences to kind of like balance that out. And that might dissipate, might just become one of those things that goes, oh, yeah, all right then, not a problem. But it can lead to these dysfunctional, these turbulent processes in relationships. Now, as I said, we're doing that all the time with most things. Our past is kind of how, in a sense, it is us. We are a sum total of everything that's ever happened to us, whatever that is, good or bad. And so the kind of negative influences we have in our past, then that creates this ripple effect down through time sometimes. And we call that psychodynamic from a theory model. Psychodynamic is going backwards to the evolution of our relationship with ourselves, if you like, and others. So when we're doing that process, when we're going through our stages of life, our stages of development, then that aspect of the past influencing the present, as I said, is not really something we think about an awful lot. But we need to have conversations about traumatic events in our past, if we can, if that's available for us, with our other parenting partner. Because if we can both have those conversations and have a look at, then it kind of pre-armed is pre-warned. So we can then think, okay, when we come to being a parent with a 3-year-old, we might then think about more this process of possible security, possible keeping safe. Now, that keeping safe and security can really become claustrophobic if it isn't checked, because that might lead to a process ongoing, not just when the child is 3, of needing to keep safe. And that will then have, as we all are a sum total of everything that's ever happened in the past, that might lead us to be more protective, more helping, in a sense, from obviously a good process. Helping some is good. But that helping can then become controlling. And that's where it can become a problem. because the controlling aspect of safety and that claustrophobic aspect can be something where other parties involved in the family unit, the relationship, it can move out to those as well, because it can become what we do naturally, normally. And you'll see that when you're talking to people. They'll say, well, relationship changed at whatever, 6 years in or whatever. And they don't necessarily understand why. And they don't see that process. And that builds over a period of time, usually when couples are in conflict. It's usually a build-up process. It's not usually conflict at that moment when they become or recognise it, if you like. So that process of building, that process of connection, is something that as we move through our relationships, it informs us from a subconscious process. So that controlling influence could then move out to other children, possibly. It could move out to partners. We could be more security conscious about them, which might hinder or restrict their world, their life, in a way. And that process of past presentations influencing present day is a whole different aspect of world when we start looking at it, when we start analysing it, when we start going over the past with maybe a timeline or some kind of tool to get things down on paper instead of being in our heads. And that process of looking at what is happening to us as we grow up, that then can be a major influence in how not just we parenting one child, but in our relationship process. We find an awful lot of, say, couple work and family work, where these building this emotional resentment, this emotional kind of turbulence, conflict, whatever's going on, that builds over a period of time. When I'm working with anybody, I kind of ask 3 questions at the beginning when I'm doing my introduction assessment, finding out history, those kind of things. I'll ask them, okay, why now? What is it now that we're looking at? What's going on? When did it start? When did it become a problem? Okay, you've realised it's a problem now, but when did it start being a problem? And what do you want to get from this process of counselling? And I think those 3 questions are really important for me because it gives me something I can anchor to. It gives me an understanding what the client wants from me. Why am I here? What am I looking to get from you? So there's a contract. There's a process of goal setting, if you like, but obviously not goals as in CBT kind of processes, but something about where we're trying to get to, a path, a journey. There's a process of looking back, which, when did this first start? Because that looking back can then give us this indication of when these processes in our life came about, because we're looking in the past. So when we're doing family work, when we're doing couple work, and individual work, to be honest, there's a process that sometimes is helpful by looking backwards, not looking forwards. Some therapies only look forwards. They don't go backwards. And that's just a different model. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. And some people are fantastic with that. People who can self-actualize, can sort themselves out. But when we're looking at things which don't make sense, which I have no idea why I'm doing this, then that looking back over the past can be helpful. But in order to do that, we have to start thinking about and maybe bringing back traumatic incidents, traumatic events, and that in our work and our lives is something that a lot of people don't want to do. They want to leave the past behind, certainly the negative aspects of past. They tend to want to forget them, bury them, stick them under the carpet, But that process is not necessarily helpful, because by burying them, which is something a lot of people do, it still influences us, which we then don't understand why we're being influenced. So if we can have a journey of understanding and inquiring about our pasts and how we got to where we are and the things that have been difficult for us, then we can be more aware of how that might impact on our present and future relationships, our present and future behaviours, you know. So when you're looking at your world, when you're looking at your life, don't always just look at where you are. Look at where you've been, because that usually is a lot more informative. Certainly where things occur and why did this happen? Why are we here? What's going on? You know, those kind of questions that we ask, which don't make sense. Those things are usually from a past historical base of something, some start point, some situation, indication. So when we become parents, then we have these influences. So when I became a parent, and I'm lucky to have two kids, although they're not kids nowadays. Their kids have kids. So I'm getting old. So when I'm going through that process of growing up, my family was very nuclear. They didn't invite people in. There was no sleepovers as they are nowadays, and no people coming into the house. There was no birthday parties, those kind of things. There wasn't anybody external coming into the family unit, and that's the way the family worked, which to me was pretty normal. Obviously, it's the only thing I've experienced, so I don't understand anything different. So I'm working with the process of that life, that world, that aspect, and I get a connection with somebody else, another family, which I become friends with. The young lad was the same age as me, and we had things in common. So I started becoming friendly with this young lad and his family, which were living down the street, weren't far away. And my parents had to go to a wedding. And so the wedding was two children only, and I'm the youngest of three. So my brother and my sister went to this wedding with my parents, and I wasn't able to go because of the numbers, not because they had anything against me. Well, I hope not. And I spent the day with this friend and his family. And I was amazed because it was a completely different world. Okay, I'd been in their house before and we'd spent time together, but I'd never really spent a full day with them. And it was a long day because, as weddings are, they're long occasions. So there's a thing afterwards, there's a do, a meal, whatever. So it was going to be probably 8, 9, 10 o'clock before my parents got back and my family got back. So there was a full day spent in the company of this family, which was great, absolutely great. Loved them to bits, and became very good friends over the years. But their experiential model of their world was completely alien to me. So in their world, in their family, in their house, during that day, there was all sorts of people came in. There was lots of people. They had a very open door kind of policy. And people come in and say, hi, how are you doing? Do you want a cuppa? Do you fancy a break, some food or a sandwich or whatever? And all these people were coming into this house, which was the same size house as ours, the council houses. They were the same size, same format, same look, same rooms, sometimes the same paper. It was a different world then. And that process of other people coming in and being welcomed in and being given food and drinks and all these things, that it was like I was sat and I was like amazed and bombarded with all this interaction that in our house was very quiet. There wasn't a lot of noise. So this noisy, this kind of socialising, this kind of buzz, it was scary at the beginning, and I was only 6. But then I got used to it. And so my experiential model was, don't invite people in, stay as we are, nothing happens, nothing changes, only we are connecting to each other, to this wide open chasm of socialising noise, which was different. But it was different in a good way for me. It was different because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed after the scary bit to start with for about an hour. It was very scary. I probably sat in a corner somewhere. But that I enjoyed at the end of the day. I'd enjoyed that experience, and I could see that there was this different world. Now, the reason why that is being talked about now, shared with you, is because when I became a parent and I had children, I actually adopted an open door policy one day of the year, which was New Year's Eve, as with most things. So we got a house in a cul-de-sac. So there was about 15 houses. So there was this open door policy on New Year's Eve. Now, I didn't do it every day. We had people in, we had sleepovers with the kids and stuff. But we didn't have that open door policy, that kind of experience I'd had at 6. But it was something I tried to recreate once a year. And that means that that past situation, which had been completely alien to me to start with, I'd enjoyed and I wanted the experience again. But it wasn't until I became a parent that that actually happened. And so that past situation, past history, became the present day situation. Now, I didn't necessarily do that consciously, okay, until I start doing what I do with the counselling, 20 odd years, reflection and thinking about things. And I became aware of that when I started doing all those kind of counselling, training and interactions. And then I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And that gave me a lot of information about my work with couples, with families, because it made me say, well, actually, let's not look at what's going now on if there's nothing that makes sense. Let's look back at our experiential model in those days when we were younger and see if that's influencing what we do now. But then my children get this process of once a year, New Year's Eve, of the house being full of people, and they may take that model and may say, oh, that's a bit too much, a bit too intense. So they will take forward with their children, as they do, a process of experience, and they will then use that in understanding how to parent and how to make their world the way they make it. So when we're looking at these things, when you're looking at these things, I think it's fascinating to look at the past history of how we experienced our world and see how that now informs us about the world. Now, the problem couples have is that we both, the two people in the couple relationship, the parenting model, we both have different views of what that past history might be. So mine is this buzz, this wonderful experience of everybody being in. I might have a relationship with somebody who isn't having those experiences brought forward. They may have had that buzz all the time, and they may react to that and say, that was too much. I need to have some privacy kind of process. So when we're looking at both parents, then both people will have different experiences. Now, depending on who is more influencing in the relationship at particular times, they will then bring forward their process of that past. So you can't just look at one parent's process of the past. You have to look at both, because that might indicate why this is occurring now. Because that balancing process, that compromise negotiation thing that we all have to do in relationships, inform us of how we then work that process in front of us, that situation that we're encountering, that relationship that we're having, and that influence that we're having on the kids, on the process. And that's fascinating. Now, that might be an awful lot to think about, and it probably is, to be fair. And it probably wouldn't be something I would have thought about before I did the counselling job and all the kind of work I've done over the years with that. But I think it's helpful, because if you can look at those things, if you can identify those drives, as we call it, those things that's happened, those scripts, the messages we're given, which I've covered in other previous podcasts, I think it's helpful because it can make sense of why we're reacting. So the past is never the past. That's a strange concoction, isn't it? The past is never the past. Sometimes the past is the present. Interesting thought. My world is weird. So when you're looking at these things that's happening in your life and your world, don't always just assume it's in the moment. Look in the past and see if there's anything influencing it. There might not be. It might just be in the moment. It might be just what it is. There might be none of this stuff going on. But if there is, then it makes kind of sense of some stuff sometimes. And then you can have better relationships. You can be more in charge of your own world, because in subconscious processes, reactions, we're not in charge usually, and we are reacting. So there's no logical process of thought in reactions. We just do what we do. But unfortunately, and I reckon about 82% of everybody's day is a subconscious reaction, which is scary. You're not thinking for 82% of the day. Not easy. But, because I don't think about putting my shirt on and doing my buttons up, I just do it. Subconscious process. But if we can look at those things, that kind of might make sense of the things that go wrong in your world, in your life. Yeah. Hopefully you found that interesting and a topic for conversation, opening up dialogue and conversation with people. But if something is happening in the moment that doesn't necessarily make sense of the reaction you're having, or somebody else is having, to be fair, then have a look in the past. And certainly where you're using a parenting model with kids, have a look at how you were parented, because that will have an influence on what you do. Good or bad, right or wrong, doesn't matter. It will just influence you. Hopefully that's made sense and been interesting. And if you'd like and share this podcast, that would be really good, because you never know who else might need the information on it. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care.